Hello and welcome to Maine Public Book Club. I'm your host, Bill Nemitz, and today we have a very special guest. If you've lived in Maine for any amount of time, you've heard the name Paul Doiron, and at the same time, the name Mike Bowditch. This is a book called Skin and Bones, and it's an anthology of short stories, which is a first for me on the book club, and I really enjoyed reading it because you don't have to follow the plot.
They're short.
You finish one and you start another. Paul, welcome. It's good to have you.
Thank you,
Bill.
I'm glad to be here.
All right, it's a real thrill. I'm going to start off with one question that because you are so intrinsically tied to Mike Bowditch. When did Paul Doiron and Mike Bowditch first meet?
Let's see. I would say it was in the 1990s, and I was a young, aspiring novelist from Maine who realized that I didn't know anything about anything except for the Maine outdoors, as it happens. And I also, at that point, decided that I wanted to write mystery novels. And so I was like, I want to write crime stories. I only know about the outdoors. I guess I should write about a game warden. But at that stage, I didn't know anything about the warden service, really, aside from what I'd been reading in
Except
papers.
when you're fishing, it's a guy to watch out for.
Yeah, I've been checked by a few.
Make sure you have your license.
I've been checked by a few, and some of them were pretty imposing. They show up in a boat, two of the guys with sidearms and things, and I was really fascinated by the profession. But I was also knowing that I was going to be writing about a guy who was roughly my age at that stage, and so it was going to be a young Maine game warden. And I didn't know Mike very well, obviously, when I was beginning. Of course, this is 2 decades later, and I know him very well.
Sure. Tell me also, I read about your brush, in terms of your interest in writing about the outdoors, your brush with lightning.
Yes.
When and how did that happen?
So when I was, I can't remember if I was 22 or 23, but I had spent a year in Los Angeles trying to get into the movie business as a script reader, junior, on my way to becoming a screenwriter, and it was just a disaster all the way around. I came back.
Hollywood spat you out.
Hollywood spat me out in less than a year, and I ended up living in my parents' basement. And here I was, this Yale graduate. They were like, "What's wrong with you, Paul? You're back in Maine." So I went camping with some friends in Grafton Notch State Park. And it's a very long story, which I don't think we have time for. But the upshot is that my friends and I got struck by lightning.
You were actually hit?
I was actually hit.
Oh my goodness.
It was a tree on the edge of the clearing in which we were camped. It was a small clearing. The electricity traveled through the sap in the tree. I was burned on my side, and a friend of mine was more seriously injured. He was in a different tent. And it was a very long night evacuating him off the mountain. We were miles from anything. But one of the people who helped was a game warden named Don Gray. And he was probably the first game warden I'd ever spoken to at any length. I mean, I didn't realize how important he was going to be in my life in a way, but...
Yeah, you hear a lot about the enforcement side, but not so much about the rescue side.
Right. Yeah, he was the closest law enforcement officer he was living, I think, in Newry, and he came up with 2 EMTs up the mountain, to help get us. And the other guys were all huffing and puffing, and Don was a warden, and he could, climb up and down mountains all day. So that was pretty cool. Ironically, when I later became a registered Maine guide, Don was on the panel that tested me.
Oh, really?
And passed me. So that was...
Did he remember you?
He didn't until I felt like I needed to come clean when we were starting out, that he knew me in case there was a conflict of interest. And he said, "Oh yeah, wasn't that a night though?" And it was.
Oh my goodness. Well, I just asked you about when you met Mike Bowditch, so to speak, and I found myself wondering, because I sense so much of you are him. It's pretty clear. but not so much in other ways,
Yeah.
in terms of, where you come from, your background, his background, that kind of thing. So I found myself wondering if Paul Doiron were to walk into one of Mike Bowditch's adventures, what would Mike Bowditch's impression of Paul be? How would he view you? Would you be the Yale guy?
I don't think so. I wasn't the Yale guy when I was at Yale.
Sure.
I was the Maine guy when I was at
okay.
Yale, wearing LL Bean boots when they
Okay.
were before they were fashionable. I think he would be suspicious of me. I think he would probably feel a little bit of kinship, but not in a way that he liked. You know, that he would sort of see in me the overeducated Maine guy that sort of looked like maybe the future he didn't want
Right.
for himself.
Plus, he's the smart guy.
But he's smarter than me.
so
I always
you-
say that Mike is smarter than I am, but I'm wiser than Mike.
Ah, okay. You mentioned, I heard you mention once that in terms of getting to know your subject, getting to know the environment in which he works, that the Maine, and I found this in my own career as a journalist, that the Maine Warden Service, I think the word you used was impenetrable, in terms of you don't just show up with a notebook or a tape recorder
Right.
and say, hey, tell me about your life. Was that, were there times when you were actually saying, hey, leave us alone, we don't want the attention, or did you just kind of decide to come in a side door in terms of understanding what they do?
Well, when I first started speaking with wardens and researching that world, it was during a troubled period in the warden service history. They had a lot of scandals back then, many of which were coming up in the Press Herald and the Telegram.
That's right.
And some of the people that I knew who were introducing me to the wardens were gadflies, So, and I was a journalist, even though it was down east, which wasn't the most heavy hitting as far as they were concerned. They were pretty closed mouth, and I would go to interview somebody, and I would ask what I thought was an open-ended question, and they would find a way to turn it into a yes or no, and I would realize they're answering me as if they were in court, having to give evidence or something. And I think in general, law enforcement, especially when you're new, is taught, maybe never explicitly, that speaking with a journalist never ends well.
Yeah. I had a similar experience with the military when I was embedded with the military, and you're trying to ingratiate yourself, anything you can think of, and some cases it worked great. It depends a lot on the personalities, but other times you just bam right into that brick wall. They're not going to let you through.
No, I think that it's one of those. These are relationships, and I've done a lot of ride-alongs, which are great for, as you know, for open-ended conversations, and you kind of drift all over the place. And people will begin to talk about things and then say, oh, I like this guy, so I said something to him. Maybe I shouldn't have said it to him. And as you establish yourself as the wardens who've spoken with me realize, hey, those things don't get into the books, or they get in a very oblique way.
Right.
And
that builds trust.
That builds trust.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. Looking to buy local? Secure your copy of our book club picks at our bookstore partners, Bookstacks in Bucksport, Devaney, Doak, and Garrett Booksellers in Farmington, Mockingbird Bookshop in Bath, Sherman's Maine Coast Bookshops, Left Bank Books in Belfast, Oliver and Friends Bookshop in Waterville, Smitty's Bookseller in Waterville, and Fiction, a novel bookshop in Wiscasset. Now back to the episode. Are you a legend in the Maine Warden Service?
I have
now?
no idea what they think of me. I
can't help but think you are. I mean, they've never had their own superhero before.
Well, I think Mike is,
Although he's not a superhero.
he's not a
right.
He's only a superhero in the sense that he could, get shot and knocked around and
Right.
still survive and have a career. It's important to me that I want to deal respectfully with the Warden Service and the profession of being a conservation law officer. I want them to feel like I'm getting most everything right, and the things I'm fictionalizing for good stories. But my wife once reminded me. She said, Paul, you're writing for 125,000 people, not 125 game wardens.
Right. But and you have to slap yourself once in a while and say, wait a minute, who's my audience?
Yes.
I'm sure.
So, but it's nice for me to get emails from wardens all over the country, who are responding to it one way or the other.
I'm curious before I move on. What was your reaction to North Maine Woods? This was the show about Maine game wardens.
It premiered after my first couple books had come out, and so there was this question in my mind. Well, which came first here? And I got to know the wardens who were stars of the show. I got to do a ride along for a filming of an episode once too. So that was really interesting to get that take on it. What you realize is that that reality TV is not reality, and that even though that these were versions of the real wardens that I was meeting, I liked it though because it was kind of a low stakes show. I mean, game wardens get involved, as you know, with every crime in Maine. They were involved in the deeply in the Lewiston mass murder.
Right.
But Northwood's Law was focusing on them rescuing loons.
It's more the stereotypical stuff.
Well, it was soft stuff.
Yeah,
and of course, the other thing that I found really funny as somebody who has to tie stories together, I mean, this is what mysteries do, right? Is so many of the episodes were very open-ended. You never knew what happened to the guy who, was caught with 20, undersized trout or whatever it was. That was probably not an episode, but.
Yeah. Well, it's also where, speaking of reality meeting fiction, I was thrilled when I started this book and realized right off the bat that I'm going to be reading about the North Pond Hermit.
Yes.
Sergeant Terry Hadn't it was.
Terry Hughes, yeah.
Called you. And
he did.
Probably before anyone else knew, I assume.
Yes.
Right?
So I hadn't met Terry much before that period, but we'd had a conversation, and when he called me, I think he was a little bit in disbelief himself, because people didn't remember that this hermit was literally legendary. Nobody was sure if he was one guy, where he was located. I mean, so Christopher Knight had been all over the Belgrade area for decades, essentially. So Terry Hughes, but Terry knew where he might show up and had set out to capture him and captured him. And then Knight took him to his camp, and Terry was blown away by how close it was to the road, how well camouflaged it was,
couldn't see it from the air.
No, everything that was there. So he called me up and said, "I have a story for you." And I knew immediately that it was going to be an international sensation. That was the journalist in me,
Yes, and it was. It produced a nonfiction book, of course.
Yeah, good one.
But you nevertheless felt this urge to take it on with considerable massaging. For example, making the protagonist Charlie Stevens.
Right.
And as I read that, and I thought, well, Charlie's perfect for this. but why not Mike?
Why not Mike? Because the whole story of the North Pond Hermit was larger than life. It felt like a tall tale. And I thought, well, this seems like the kind of thing an old man tells a young man, and the young man's like, no.
Yeah.
I know you're exaggerating this, and I don't like to spoil my stories, but at the end, Charlie reveals something that's physical proof. No, this actually happened. And in fact, I modeled that short story, which is called The Bear Trap, on a Mark Twain story. It's my take on something Mark Twain would have written, that period of where everything was, a yarn, I was spinning a yarn kind of thing.
Oh, and the stakeouts and I mean, parts of it are hilarious.
Good.
The extent that he went to try to outfox this guy who was obviously pretty canny himself. Uh, a lot of people have talked about this, and I will add my voice to it. Your description, your descriptive power in your stories is just perfect. I mean,
Thank you.
It really, anybody who knows Maine and has been around the woods is instantly transported. But I also liked your turns of phrase. The one that made me laugh out loud, and I can't remember, it might have been, I can't remember which one it was, where you liken an Airstream camper to a suppository. And I laughed.
I'm sorry, it's wrong to laugh at yourself. But
And then I laughed, and then I said, wait a minute, he's right. where does that stuff come from? Were you driving through the countryside one day and saw one of those? Or, how do you, I mean, it's an unlikely comparison, but it's a very apt one.
Yes. Well, I think my imagination and my sort of verbal intelligence always goes in that direction. So I'm probably stylistically my greatest influence is Raymond Chandler, and of course, Philip Marlowe's world is completely different from the backwoods of Maine. So I get to use all those metaphors and similes in a different way,
But you can still wisecrack.
I can still wisecrack. Yeah, Mike is not personally much of a wisecracker in his dialogue, but he has some asides here and there and in his descriptions.
Yeah. Now, as I said in the opening, this is an anthology, and I found myself, as somebody who wrote for a living, wondering what it was like for you to. In your mind, the difference between short stories and novels. Somebody might look at this and say, are these novels that didn't reach enough altitude? Or what differentiates these stories from the ones that turned into full-blown books?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, when you're studying to be a creative writer, they have you write short stories. So it wasn't a form that I was unfamiliar with. It was something I'd done never successfully, in my 20s.
In fact, wasn't The Poacher's Son a short story?
No, it wasn't originally.
Okay.
That I knew was going to, it had to be a
go
novel.
full length.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the short stories, they always have started as stories, and they were intended, honestly, to kind of amuse me more than anything else, because I never knew how they were going to be published, and the fact that my publisher wanted to bring them out, in print as this anthology was a great surprise to me. They're all filling in gaps of what I call the Mike Bowditch fictional universe. So, there's the characters that are in the novels, like Charlie Stevens and Kathy Frost and some of the other ones, who appear in the stories, and it fills in background. Here's something I've never told you about Charlie, about his history, an episode in his life. But
yeah, Charlie has some pretty powerful moments in these stories.
Yeah, I wanted to explore him a bit, because I always go into anything that I write not knowing what I don't know.
Yeah.
And I write the story, and I discover something about Charlie, his history in Vietnam and that sort of thing. And that's part of the pleasure for me, is just allowing myself to be surprised by whatever it is that I'm writing.
And I found at the end of several of them, it's not the classic tie it up, boom, we're done. It's just kind of like they're going along, and they're going to keep going, but they end.
Right.
And that is that part of the trying to create bridges between your stories that I want so many times. At the end of one of these, I wanted to say no,
keep going.
Keep going.
Well, that's good. I think it's because even though I write mystery novels, and I love the way that detective stories, open and close, and I never think of what I'm writing in those terms. I do feel like I'm getting these brief windows into the lives of these characters, and that they do have, stories that are continuing after I've written the end.
Life goes on.
Life goes on, yeah. So that's just the way that I approach stuff. It's different, I think, from a lot of mystery writers.
Have a favorite quote from this book? Want to know if anyone else is thinking as much about a plot twist as you are? New this year, join us on Goodreads to chat with your fellow Mainers about our book club picks throughout the season. Learn more at www.mainepublic.org/book club. Now back to the book. I want to talk about them and your choice of locales. Again, not to keep citing my own experience, but I found a lot of parallels between what we've done over the years. And I remembered that feeling of going into a small town, really, Piscataquis County, Worcester County, Penobscot, way out in the middle of nowhere. And some story has drawn me there. And you go in and you kind of park your car outside the diner, take that deep breath, stuff your notebook in your back pocket, hoping nobody will see it when you first walk in, and there you go. Was that hard for you? How did you do it? How did you soften up a diner full of disinterested people?
I don't know that I always do still. I feel like a lot of times, and I'm sure this was your experience as well, you're visiting some town, and you go, as you say, to the place where all the guys are getting breakfast before they go off to their contracting jobs or whatever, and you're sitting there with your cup of coffee, and you're the only person that they've never seen in that establishment before.
And things get a little quiet.
Things get very quiet. It's like, who's he? What's he want? But
until one of them finally says, "So, what brings you here?"
Brings you here. And a lot of times people are really eager to talk about what makes their community special. Let's put it that way. Sometimes it's, it can be the unflattering story that they really want to talk about. And that's where as you get windows into the community, and it's like
and leads on who to go
right,
to
who
next.
to talk to next, and twists and turns, things that you would just never imagine.
Right. How do you find your characters?
Becca
is a good example.
Which one?
Becca, the woman who owns a store in Kentsville.
Oh, right. Yes, Becca. Becca Bray.
Yeah, Becca Bray.
Yeah.
And so many of these people, and I'm sure you've heard this before, I came across them and I said, "Oh, yeah." She works down at the corner store. I live in Buxton.
Yes.
How do you catalog these encounters? Do you go through a normal day? You don't have a specific objective, but you come across someone and say, "I gotta file that person away."
Sometimes. I think a lot of it is just having lived in Maine almost my entire life. I mean, I went away for college.
You grew up in
Scarborough,
yeah.
Sanford originally. But it's just knowing Mainers so well. And my family is, my dad was the first one in his family to go to college. And so, I used to joke all the time about having cousins who were professional dishwashers, that sort of thing. And I really like Mainers. But I will have an idea for a character. There's a character in one of the stories named Ricky Elwell, who's the teenage deer cutter. He's a butcher of deer, and I just knew what I wanted him to be from the beginning. But I got his wardrobe from Walmart. I mean, I was in Walmart one day and I saw this guy going by in flip-flops and white socks and gym shorts, and it was just that's how
him.
Ricky dresses right there. And
so it connects.
Yes, and so that's where that came from. Yeah.
We're running out of time, and there are a couple of questions I really wanted to ask. What beyond the obvious, given your experience with them, beyond the obvious, which is enforcing Maine's hunting and fishing laws, what do you think sets Maine game wardens apart from other law enforcement?
Perspective. I think they have a broader perspective on their community than many do. and I don't want
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to damn anybody, but I think it's because I've often said that if you ever want to talk to somebody who knows about rural poverty, talk to a game warden. And police often do, of course, but usually they won't be thinking about how is this family eating necessarily.
No.
Wardens do, because of
Right.
course they're dealing with poaching.
Right, but they're thinking about evidence and that kind of
Right.
thing.
I mean, they see the broad scope
Sure,
of a life.
Sure. And that segues into another question, and it plays off what you just said. A few times in these stories, the whole concept of, I guess you'd call it backwoods justice,
Yeah.
if you will. Charlie keeping his secret in skin and bones. Violet Baker getting away with murder in The Caretaker. As Charlie told Mike at the end of one story, sometimes justice is revenge served in a three-piece suit. After Mike insists that all criminals should be brought to justice. What is your concept? How do you describe justice in the rural?
Oh, in the
sections
rural
of
world,
Maine?
yeah. Well, I think it's an acknowledgement of the reality. I have a novel out now called Stormtide, and Stormtide is about murderers who got away with it until a vigilante decides that no, they're not going to get away with it.
And some would call that justice.
And some would call that justice. I think it is just it's a fact of life that people do. We want that closure. We want that fairness, right? People who did wrong should be punished,
even if it's not always delivered by the system.
No, and of course that I think that's one of the pleasures of crime stories is typically they do get punished, but I suppose it's just my even though I never think of my stories as being hyper realistic, I think maybe the realist part of it is, hey, they don't always. And so you have to look for whatever consolations you get.
That visceral relief.
The relief that, they got away with it, but they're miserable.
Well, we have just enough time for me to ask the obvious question, and that is, what's next for Mike Bowditch?
Well, so the 17th novel will be published next June. It's written, it's edited. I haven't seen the cover for it yet. I will tell you that it's titled Cold Front.
Cold Front.
Because it features a KGB general, of all things, a defector. Don't ask me where that came from.
I'm thinking Canadian
but
border.
But it's a Mike Bowditch story. You'll have to read it to find out how.
And beyond that, there are others
Yes,
planned?
so I have, I have books contracted through 2029.
Oh, okay.
And they're still
I'm
selling
sure
well.
your
So
fans will be relieved to hear that,
Yeah.
because this guy just lives on and on. How old will Mike? Well, how old is he in your?
in the book that I just finished writing,
yeah.
he turns 35.
30. Oh my! So
He's
you're
35.
You're outpacing him.
Yeah, sadly.
With all due respect.
No, but it's actually it leaves me a lot to write about still
Yeah.
with his life.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, I have other questions, but we don't have any more time. So I really appreciate your coming and joining us today, and I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who will be waiting with bated breath for the next one. Keep up the great work, Paul.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it.
And thank all of you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.